So I'm going to continue at high speed as I have been. I'm moving quickly through these chapters. Our goal is to be done 2 hours from now, God willing. So if you are, hopefully you're at the same place where we left off. Yesterday we were talking about the devastating waters of the flood. I want to read now beginning at verse 21 of chapter 7 because we have a description here of mass extinction and destruction. It really is a pretty sad read. When you read it, verse 21, all flesh that moved on the earth perished, birds and cattle and beasts and every swarming thing that swarms upon the earth and all mankind, of all that was on the dry land, all in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life, died. Thus he blotted out every living thing that was upon the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to birds of the sky, and they were blotted out from the earth, and only Noah was left, together with those that were with him in the ark. The water prevailed upon the earth 150 days. Now, what's fascinating to me about this is that a very, very simple observation of conditions on planet Earth eminently support what we just read. In fact, if we take a look at what would be the expected results of a global catastrophe like this, it matches exactly what we see in the geology today. For example, one of the things that we would expect would be fossilization on a massive global scale. We would expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers that have been laid down by water, and we would expect to find this all over the earth. Well, guess what? This is exactly what we find all over the earth. A lot of people don't realize that fossilization is actually very rare. Like when a fish dies, what does it do? It gradually floats to the bottom, slowly gets covered with silt, and turns into a fossil. Are you kidding? When a fish dies, it floats to the top generally and gets eaten. Fossilization is a very rare process. It requires rapid burial. It requires that the organism be cut off from all oxygen supply very quickly, that preferably it have some pressure to bear on it, and it will turn into rock fairly quickly over a relatively short period of time. All across the planet, we find literally billions of animals that were buried so quickly that it's obvious they were even still moving when it happened. And they are so well preserved. I'm just giving you some examples. Some of them still show the color of their skin. This is not a fish that sat waiting thousands of years to be fossilized. It was very rapidly buried. Here you see once again the color of the skin. Here you have an animal that's in the process of giving birth, and it is buried while being in the process of giving birth. On the lower right, you have an interrupted meal with one fish swallowing another fish. Here's a close-up of that, and it's buried in that condition. Here they found 9 pairs of turtles in the process of mating, buried quickly. Normally, when you're mating, it would be very, very difficult to slowly be overcome over a period of years by mud or whatever to bury you. Here are 2 fish looking at each other. I mean, you can still see the colors. Here's a dragonfly. The preservation is so well done, you can see the lines on the very fine wings. This is rapid, very rapid burial, while the animal is almost no doubt still alive. Here you see the webbing of the bat. Here you see a whole school of fish swimming, buried exactly like that. Another school of fish swimming. Here you have a ray fish there. You can see what normally is just flesh. You can still see the contours of it. That thing was buried so rapidly. Here you still see the fur on this animal, buried rapidly. Here's a section of glittery fish scales from Dinosaur National Monument. Once you expose that to the air, it doesn't last for very long. It was buried very, very rapidly. And it's not just animals, it's forests. Like if you look at the Illinois State Geological Survey website, they will tell you here about these ginormous forests here in America that were buried rapidly, and they've turned into coal. In fact, the following pictures are from a mine in east central Illinois, 250 feet below ground. Massive trees rapidly buried by the tens of thousands. That tree trunk is 6 feet wide and 120 feet long. I have to keep moving fast through all these, but just amazing. Like even the leaves rapidly buried. Here's a whole tangle of leafy branches rapidly buried. Here you have, right here you've got a spray of long, relatively thin leaves. Again, rapidly buried. A tangle of tree fern leaves and stems. Very delicate, rapidly buried. This is exactly what a global flood would do. We find petrified forests, trees turned into rock, and they run through several layers of rock. Per the evolutionists, those layers represent millions of years. So we would therefore have to believe that the top of the tree was above ground for millions of years without rotting until gradually the layers built up and covered it and turned it into stone. That's a major issue. It's a major problem for these long ages And you have hundreds of examples of these. Here you have a spark plug that's already encased in rock. So either people in the Cro-Magnon age were running vehicles with spark plugs, or rock forms faster than we think. Here's a bottle encased in rock. Here's a metal pipe that's totally blocked by mineral deposits. It had petrified in just 3 months. So mass fossilization, friends, is exactly what we would expect to see. The Grand Canyon has more than 1 billion fish buried, many of them in like twisted positions of agony. And even the secular geologists will admit to that. How do you get billions of fish fossilized like this? When fossilization is a very rare phenomenon, it takes just the right conditions. We would expect a graduated fossil record. We would expect that largely the smaller ones would be near the bottom, and in general, the larger ones would be nearer the top. And evolution explains that by millions of billions of years. But if you have global water moving around the planet with the lunar tides pulling a wave constantly around the planet with no shoreline to stop it, it's sifting up and down and up and down and up and down for over 100 days. It's sifting out by density. It's sifting out by body weight and density. It's sifting out by size. Even from the standpoint of the animals that would get to higher ground, larger animals would be able to get to higher ground generally easier than smaller animals would. So we would expect, in general, larger animals buried near the top, smaller animals buried near the bottom. And there are thousands of exceptions to that. So your worldview has to deal with all of these exceptions as well. And a flood would certainly allow for many exceptions, and yet a general sifting out of animals by body size as they're being buried. We would expect twisted rock layers. Why? Because as this water is sifting out by density all this mud and dirt, it's laying it down in big sheets of it that have very clearly defined straight lines that define the different layers. And while they're still relatively soft and malleable, you have land masses that are sliding into each other and crumpling up, and all these layers are curving. And then they're hardening into rock. We find this all over the earth, examples of twisted rock. And we're supposed to believe that millions and millions of years of force twisted solid rock gradually into beautiful curves without cracking it. The flood explains this far more rationally. I mean, I could give you hundreds, really thousands of pictures of this kind of thing, of layers that were laid down clearly while they were still malleable, while they still could be formed, bent into curves. We would expect massive canyons carved by huge quantities of fast-moving, receding water. We would expect exactly something like the Grand Canyon. We're told that the Little Colorado River carved that out over millions of years. And yet, even today, floods carve out canyons so fast that we're amazed how quickly it happened. Mount St. Helens was a good example of carving of canyons that had stratified layers that had been laid down within weeks because of the volcanism of Mount St. Helens. And so we would expect things like the Grand Canyon. I'm told, although I haven't verified this, but I'm told that if you were to fill the Grand Canyon back up, that the entry point of the Colorado River would actually be lower than its exit point. So the Colorado River wouldn't at the beginning even be flowing in that direction anyway, to even start the carving process. If you back up into space and take a look at the Grand Canyon, it's not quite so grand, right? You know what it looks like? It looks like a kid's sandbox into which the child poured a bottle of water or something, and it ran down and it made these canyons. And then along comes a little ant and looks at the massive canyon from his perspective and says, whoa, it took millions of years to form this. No, it took a kid about 5 minutes. It's a matter of perspective. You either form this by a small quantity of water over a very long period of time, but how about a large quantity of water over a very short period of time? Why is that not just as viable an option? This is exactly what we'd expect to find on planet Earth if there had been a global flood. So this is exactly what we find all over the world, which then, of course, raises this issue. There's no need to look for evidence of the global flood. It's absolutely everywhere, all over planet Earth. And I've summarized a lot of issues very quickly here. So if it's so obvious, why don't people believe it? The Bible answers that question. For this they willfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. They willfully forget this. These are the scorners, these are the scoffers that say, no, everything has remained the same ever since the beginning. That's uniformitarian evolutionary mindset. But the Bible says this is a willing, deliberate issue here. It is a religion against another religious view. Evolution is a religion. It actually requires more faith to believe many of the tenets of evolution than a simple, straightforward reading of Genesis. The problem, friends, is not the possession of evidence. It is always the suppression of evidence. And Romans 1 makes that very clear. People who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, the existence of God, it is evident within them. God made it evident to them because since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, eternal power, divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made. They exchange the truth of God for a lie. They worship and serve the creature rather than the Creator who is blessed forever. This is Paul's indictment of the fallen human race in which we find ourselves. And even Jesus said, look, if your heart is hardened in unbelief, you will not believe even if somebody rises from the dead. Right? He says, look, they have Moses and the prophets. And if they're not going to be willing to listen to Moses and the prophets, which was the Bible of Jesus' time, the Old Testament at the time, if they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, they're not going to be persuaded, even if someone rises from the dead. Many years ago, I gave up the hopeless endeavor of trying to persuade somebody into salvation just by logic and human reason. Now, there's a place for the defense of the faith and apologetics, but people don't come to salvation because we manage to answer all of the questions. There is a moving of the Spirit of God on the lives of people that we need to be praying for as we share the gospel. And we do need to be ready to give an answer for anybody who asks us the reason for our faith. That's true. But, proving things logically by themselves will not always, in fact, very rarely reach somebody who is deliberately hardening their heart against the truth. I used to think that everybody wanted truth. And if they could be shown truth, they would immediately embrace it. Well, I know the truth about Doritos, but I still eat more than I should, right? We all have our ways of ignoring truth, suppressing it, denying it, setting it to the side, deliberately forgetting about it. And if we do that on a small scale, it can also be done on a grand scale as well. Well, some people say, well, it wasn't a global flood, it was just a local flood. All right, so we're going to buy the Bible up to a point. Yeah, there was a big flood, but it was just a local one. And the Bible is teaching a local flood, not a global flood. Well, how would the Bible answer that? What would be biblical evidence of a global flood, not a local flood? How about this one? Number one, the need to build an ark. Like if it was a local flood, why doesn't God tell Noah and his family to just get out of the way? Why invest 50 to 75 years to build a ginormous boat? You could walk a tremendous distance in that length of time to get away from a local flood. The very need to build an ark itself. Why take so long to build an ark? You could travel a long way to safety in 50 to 75 years. Secondly, the death of all humans, we're told. All humans and non-aquatic animals. And all means all, it's all it all means. All humans and non. If it was a local flood, that statement wouldn't hold. The Bible would be incorrect at several places. The Bible is clearly teaching a global flood. We take it or we leave it, but we have to let it tell us what it's telling us. I'm going to move pretty quick, but hopefully you're going to have time to capture these. Again, in a pretty sad drawing here, but just imagine that. All human beings outside of Noah's family and all animals died. The covering of the highest mountain. The Bible is clear that the highest then existing mountain was covered to a depth of 30 cubits. And that would allow for the ark to pass over it without hitting the top of it. The covering of all the highest mountains. Just think of this very, very easily here now. How could you have a local flood and still cover all the highest mountain? I'll show you how you could do it. Here's what it would look like to have a local flood that covers the highest mountain. It would have to stop at the peak of the highest mountain, because if it flows over to the next valley, it's going to overflow that valley and overtake the next lower mountain. So the fact that the highest mountain is covered is clear evidence that it's a global flood that's being taught in the book of Genesis. The length of stay in the ark. It took 330 days for the water to recede. Like if this was a local flood, why don't just paddle over to the edge and hop out? No, they're in that boat for nearly a year. Clearly, Genesis is teaching a global flood. And perhaps most importantly of all, friends, is God's promise to never send such a flood again. God promised to never do this again. So if it was a local flood, guess what? We've had thousands of local floods since that time. Therefore, we would have thousands of instances where God had broken his promise. Again, we take this or we leave it, but we can't mess with meaning without getting a meaningless mess. The Bible is teaching a global flood. If the flood was local, God would have broken his promise thousands of times. But God has remained committed to his covenant promise. It gets mentioned more than once in the rest of the Bible that God has remained faithful to this covenant promise. Isaiah chapter 54, verses 9 and 10 would be a good example. Here's a little cartoon, So he believes that God promised to never again send a localized flood. I mean, he would be well within his rights to ask a question like that incredulously if the Bible was actually teaching that God was promising to never send a local flood. One last thing I would like to mention is that it's fascinating to see that in over 200 cultures around the world, there are well-established flood traditions. And many of them have the exact same components of Genesis, some of them more than others. This is a chart that only shows you some from amongst the 200 plus nations that have global flood legends within their history. Clearly, a common denominator here is that there was a ginormous flood in ancient human history. And so on the left-hand side, you have the different components of the story given to us in Genesis. Here you have a listing of some of these empires and nations. Green block means you have a full representation of the biblical idea. A red triangle means you have a partial representation of the biblical idea. This has to be dealt with. This has to be acknowledged. And so often it's just dismissed out of hand. But if you were to find in the nations of the world legends that a UFO had landed, centuries ago, and that extraterrestrials had stepped out on the planet, our culture would be paying attention to that. It would probably foster some significant movies and books, et cetera, et cetera. But the flood is poo-pooed all around the world when, in fact, the evidence is overwhelming. Whether you want to talk geology or whether you want to talk history, et cetera. Here is the Chinese character for boat. Interestingly, it's made up of these words, vessel, eight, and people/mouths. Again, a really interesting linkage. Well, we jump into chapter 8, and we have recovery from the flood. And this particular chapter is one that I go through really, really quickly. I don't spend a lot of time here. But this chapter does give us a chronology of the flood. It tells us that God remembered Noah and the beasts and all the cattle that were with him in the ark. God remembered them. Implication? God didn't forget about them. Implication, God was looking after them. God was taking care of them. There are many ways in which he might have done this. Like feeding all of those animals may not have been as difficult as we imagine. God could very well have put many of those animals into a state of hibernation, for example. He had directed those animals to the ark supernaturally. He could certainly care for them in the ark as well. They may have been placed in a state of hibernation. At least some of them could have. Genesis 8:17 allows for that in its vocabulary. It doesn't knock that possibility out. So verses 2 through 19, we have a chronology of the flood. It's all in your notes. The only thing I really want to highlight here is that the flood, based on all that we're seeing here, lasted 370 days from first rain until they stepped back out of the boat. So just over a year. Just over one orbit of the earth around the sun. So the flood lasting 370 days from first rain until the exit from the ark. If you really, really want to be stickly about this, you would have to add an additional 7 days that Noah was in the ark before the flood began. Because God told him to go in, and then God brought the animals into him where he was. That lasted for 7 days. So in terms of, though, when the water actually started, that's what I'm saying, from first rain until the exit from the ark is 370 days. We come to verse 20, and as soon as they come out, we read that Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird. Remember, clean now, clean, not unclean, because you don't offer unclean animals for sacrifice. He takes of every clean animal, every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled the soothing aroma, and the Lord said to himself, I will never again curse the ground. There you have God talking to himself. The Lord said to himself. Is that weird? No, he's a multiple within himself. Their communication happens within the Trinity in some fashion. And so I'll never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time, harvest, cold, heat, summer, winter, day and night shall not cease. So we have Noah's offering here. I'm not sure if things quite look so beautiful as it is portrayed in this picture here. I think it was pretty devastating to step out onto what was left of planet Earth. The continents probably had been massively rearranged. That single landmass was probably at this point now divided into the continents that we see today. It was a vastly different landscape that Noah steps out onto. God had sovereignly raised mountains, lowered ocean basins to get the water off of the land and put it into places that would hold it until the end of human history, so the water would never come back on a global scale to flood the earth. So you have Noah offering this. It's very interesting. It says it was a soothing aroma to the Lord. And the Hebrew word is Nikoah here. It kind of harks back, as there's a subtle link here to Noah's name. What does Noah's name mean? Rest. So you almost kind of see Noah's name inside the Hebrew word here, a quieting, calming thing. That's how this offering is described. We also note that the flood didn't solve the sin problem. The sin nature was preserved. God acknowledges that here in verse 21. And we're going to see that certainly that's going to play out in the rest of history because, from this point forward, we can see that sin hasn't disappeared. Well, the last thing I want to highlight here in chapter 8 is verse 22. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest and cold and heat and summer and winter and day and night shall not cease. This is the first time that seasons are mentioned and that cold is mentioned and that winter is mentioned. So we have to be careful here because arguing from silence is not the strongest form of argument. But it does seem probable that the flood would have provoked massive climate change. And, prior to the flood, drastic seasonal changes were likely unknown prior to the flood, but clearly come into play after the flood, for sure. And last night, those of you that came out, we did a little bit more work on this than what I can do in class. And so I'm going to move pretty quickly through this, but for sure there would have been a short ice age that would have ensued. It could have been as long as 700 years, according to some of the calculations and computer modeling that has been done on this. A short ice age would have ensued while the earth regained a state of equilibrium. I showed this slide last night in the seminar. This is the predicted locations of ice following the flood for a few hundred years at least. Because you're going to be dealing now with warm oceans. You're going to be dealing with an atmosphere that has a lot of debris in it. You've got a lot of volcanism going on. You've got a lot of lowering of the Earth's temperature because of all of this stuff that's being ejected up into the upper atmosphere. Massive loss of vegetation and reduced growth rates would have resulted in the extinction of larger animals that consumed a lot of food. Other possible side effects that have been explored are things like reduced atmospheric pressure, reduced oxygen content, increased solar radiation. We know that in ancient history, animals grew way bigger than they do today. This is a dragonfly. I showed it to you earlier. What I didn't tell you earlier is that thing is 30 inches wide. We don't have dragonflies this big anymore. Clearly, there was something about the conditions, probably prior to the flood, that led to much greater growth rates than we know today. And I'm going to leave it at that. But we did talk quite a bit about this last evening. Human lifespans clearly began to plummet after the flood. There seems to be a link between the two. Here is a charting of human lifespans all the way up into the late 1800s, and the flood is right there. Like it's hard to not see some sort of connection between the two. Here's a chart you've already seen. If you look at the lifespans to the left of the flood line, that's the big black vertical line, and then the lifespans to the right, clearly something significant is happening with lifespans, and it does seem to be tied to the flood. This might also be connected in with this whole thing of post-flood climate change. And I'm going to leave that topic at that. We did more work on that last night in the seminar. So we have completed section 1, which is about creation. We've completed section 2, which was about catastrophe, and that leaves us the last section, which is about cultures, the source of nations, the table of nations, and the scattering of nations. So we turn to chapter 9, and I'm going to use the picture of the Tower of Babel to represent this section of Genesis 1 to 11, chapters 9, 10, 11, cultures. And you come to chapter 9, and I'm entitling this chapter, Source of Nations. And we read this, that God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." The fear of you and the terror of you will be on every beast of the earth and on every bird of the sky, with everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are given. What I started reading here is a fascinating series of 7 verses that contain some really intriguing instructions or revelations, new information. And I want to unpack, I think it's 5 of them here, that are really, really significant. For example, the first thing God says, his first instruction is, hey, multiply and spread out. Multiply and fill the earth. Now, clearly God would not have commanded them to do something that was not doable. So obviously they were able to multiply because there was 4 married couples there. But it also says they were to fill the earth. So it somehow must have been possible, even in the new topography of planet Earth, to spread out across all the continents. So I'm going to leave that dangling there for just a minute because I'm coming back to it. But notice the instruction. Multiply, spread out. Mankind will deliberately disobey this. In Genesis 11, they're going to say, hey, come, let's build a tower so that we will not be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. We're going to stick together. We are not spreading out. But God's clear instructions was that they were to multiply and they were to spread out. Number 2, God places a fear into the heart of animals, a fear of human beings. This simply tells us that this fear must not have been there prior to the flood. Because God now says here in verse 2, the fear of you and the terror of you will be on every beast of the earth. Clear implication, it had not been there before. So now God puts this fear into their hearts. And why would he do this? The most logical conclusion is that God is seeking to curb something that was a major issue prior to the flood. And what was that? The earth was filled with violence. The earth was filled with violence. Every thought of the intent of man was evil continually, but the earth was filled with violence. And there's no reason to exclude animal violence out of that. So again, I've already said this, but imagine 1,650 plus years of escalating violence, not only among human beings who are following Cain's example of murder, but you now also have, most likely, tremendous animal violence. And if animals are not afraid of human beings, as they are today, that would create a very interesting scenario. It's always fascinated me that animals that could easily take me out will run away from me when I approach them. The last time I did an African safari, I chased off a lion, I chased off 2 male elephant bulls, and I am lying through my teeth right now. But, it's interesting. These animals that could take you out so easily, for the most part, instinctively move away from you. Why is that? From a pure biological survival of the fittest standpoint, it doesn't really make sense. Well, they're afraid of gunfire. Well, maybe in modern times, but let's back all the way back up to here in the story. God is putting a provision in here to curb animal violence. Man has lost his dominion over the animal kingdom. This is a step, no doubt, to reduce the violence that characterized the pre-flood world. But one of the unfortunate things about it, though, too, is that it further alienated animals from man, further alienated them from us. God goes on to say in the next verse, watch this now, verse 3. Every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you. I give all to you as I gave, past tense, the green plant. Back in Genesis 1, God had said, I'm giving you all these plants for food to you and also to the animals. Now God expands the menu out. And he says in verse 3, every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you. I give it all to you as I gave the green plant. So letter C, meat can now be eaten, but watch now. It says verse 4, only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. You can eat the meat, but you're not to eat the blood with the meat. By the way, some would say, and I think there's some good idea behind this, that in some respects, this might have been secondarily a provision of God because there was so much devastation of botanical devastation. Like all the fruit trees were gone, largely destroyed. It would take years and years, for the trees to come back. Now, of course, you have not very many animals either. So it's probably simply this, that while the animals are regaining their numbers and while fruit-bearing plants and vegetable-bearing plants are regaining their numbers, God allows them to eat from both, parts of the menu, so to speak. But God never retracts this. We have Jesus eating meat in the New Testament. So it was perhaps something for a practical purpose right then, but God clearly never retracted that and intended that it would continue to this day. So in God's eyes, why is this issue of eating the blood so significant? Well, God says you can eat it, verse 4, but only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. So what's that all about? Well, in God's eyes, the life of a being is identified with its blood. God considers that to be the life. It's like Abel's blood is crying out to me from the ground. Now, we don't get a whole lot more teaching on this in the Bible until we get into the book of Leviticus. But we find out that in the book of Leviticus that blood is intimately tied and identified with the life of a being. And therefore, to take the blood of an animal within oneself is to identify myself with that being. It symbolizes union/identification with the life of the being. And the blood of animals was used to atone for sin, but it could not remove sin. So God did not want them to identify too intimately with the life of an animal, only up to a point. And this seems to be the whole rationale here, and as you study it in other places like Leviticus 17, for why they were not to eat the blood with the meat, which always raises questions like, can I have a rare steak today? I'm not even going to talk about that right now because we're going to talk more about this in Leviticus chapter 17. But they were to pour the blood out, and then they would eat the meat. Interestingly, Jesus later on talks about eating his flesh and drinking his blood. Remember that text? And it says that a bunch of his disciples left him and stopped following him because they were really freaked out by that. What was Jesus driving at? And I'm going to say this real quick because I don't have time to unpack it all right now. But there is a sense in which Jesus is alluding to this right here. When we are taking the cup, which represents the blood of Christ, we are proclaiming our profound, intimate union with the very life of Jesus, who is now my life. I was crucified with him on the cross. I died. I was buried with him. And I rose again with him. And Paul says, I'm no longer the one living. It's Christ living in me. He is now my life. And so, yes, we do proclaim in the taking of the cup our intimate identification with Jesus. But with respect to animals, God didn't want them identifying that intimately with the animals. The next thing he says is in verse 6. Well, I'll read 5 for context. Surely I will require your lifeblood from every beast, I will require it. And from every man's brother, I will require the life of man. Watch this now, verse 6. Whoever sheds man's blood, in other words, commits murder, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. Why? For in the image of God he made man. So God had just said, go ahead, you can kill animals and eat them. Pour the blood out, but you can eat the animals. Now, I don't know if this thought crossed anybody's mind at the time, but it was like, well, what about humans? Can we kill and eat humans? God quickly moves to say, no, that's a different category. Human beings are in the image of God. And for that reason, if any human being sheds the blood of another human being, then the murderer's blood is to be shed by another human being, somebody who will extract justice there. And so what we have here, even though it doesn't use this terminology, it's describing what we call today capital punishment. And we learn within it that killing a human is murder because man is made in the image of God. Here's where Genesis once again stays consistent as a worldview. Again, in evolutionary thought, we are just highly evolved animals, and yet everybody, mostly, largely, would say that murder is wrong. Well, why would it be wrong to kill a human being and not wrong to kill an animal when we're all basically from the same stock? Well, Genesis provides a viable explanation for that. Human beings are not animals. We are created uniquely in the image of God, and so taking the life of a human is considered murder. Taking the life of an animal is not. And I'm always happy, therefore, to kill the mosquitoes and the flies for the glory of Jesus and for my own protection, But you've got this differentiation. So fundamentally, this is what separates mankind from the animal kingdom. And then letter E that goes with this, and I already mentioned it, is this whole concept of capital punishment, which God institutes right here at this point in human history as they step out of the ark. And again, if we back away from the scene and think of the larger picture, and we think of the pre-flood world and how it was characterized by violence, and how it starts with Cain, who's a murderer, and then the other guy whose name I'm forgetting now, who becomes a murderer, and the clear implication being that the earth is filled with, well, it's not just an implication, the text tells us, it's filled with violence. God seems to be putting a provision now into the system to curb that. There is to be retribution upon somebody who will take the life of another person. It's another step to curb the violence that marked the pre-flood world, and it's interesting that even animals are held accountable for the death of humans. You notice how it says here, "Surely I will require your lifeblood from every beast. I will require it, and from every man." So, following carefully the wording, even though it doesn't go on to describe more here, it actually includes animals who are held accountable if they kill a human being. And by the way, I know this is a very controversial topic, but all I can tell you is that capital punishment has never been rescinded in the Scriptures. In fact, you come into the book of Romans chapter 13, and we clearly find out that human government is a heaven-approved concept. And that it will clearly say it is not for no reason at all that they hold the sword, because they are a minister of good on God's behalf. And what makes this such a hot topic and a difficult one is that it is true that in a fallen world there has been many examples, many examples of betrayed justice. People whose lives have been taken when it was not justified to do so. And that is a reality in the fallen world in which we live. We don't have a perfect justice system. I'll give you a little clue why we don't have a perfect justice system. It's because nobody is a perfect judge. To be a perfect judge, you would have to be at least two things. You'd have to be omniscient and omnipresent. If you could have those two qualities, you could be a witness to every crime, and you could know all details, including the motives of the person doing the crime. That would make you a perfect judge. But because no human being has ever been found with omniscience and omnipresence, that's why we have to function with a system of witnesses that are brought in to tell the judge what he didn't see, and to inform the judge of stuff that he doesn't automatically know. And then he has to make the best decision based on the information that he has. I'm here to tell you the Bible teaches, though, that there's coming a day where there will be perfect justice upon the earth. And you know why? Because there will be a perfect judge here. And he is omniscient, and he is omnipresent, and he is omnipotent as well. His name is Jesus Christ, the last Adam. And when he rules and reigns on the earth, he will rule and reign in perfect righteousness and justice. Which is why Jesus says in the Beatitudes, "Blessed are they who hunger and thirst after justice or righteousness, because they will be satisfied." Future, they will be satisfied. I digressed a bit there, but you have capital punishment being installed. And if you dig a bit deeper here, what God is really establishing is a concept that we just take for granted today. And it's this whole concept of the legitimacy of what we would call human government. This idea that you could have a humanly administered system of order and justice. And God is handing to man the right to exact the greatest penalty of all in the carrying out of justice. And this whole concept of justice and of a judicial system and of right and wrong, and that it is a God-ordained thing, Romans chapter 13, for there to be people who administer justice as ministers of God and who hold a sword. All of this launches in Genesis 1 to 11. Once again, we see how foundational these texts are. If evolution is true, then justice is a social construct. It's not a fixed reality. It is not a fixed absolute reality. It's a social construct. We agree as a whole bunch of highly evolved animals, we're going to just say that murder is wrong. But what happens if in a different culture they decide that murder is okay? Then in the spirit of the postmodern toleration, we ought to say, we will respect you in your justice system that allows for murder, while we have a justice system that doesn't allow for murder. But if we go there, then we have to let them fly their planes into our buildings because for them, it's okay. We would never want that because there is such a thing as right and wrong. In our minds, it's black and white, and it's not a social construct. It's grounded in an absolute truth. And even people who deny absolute truth, they will say that you're not allowed to kill their kid. Why not? Because it's wrong. Well, I don't believe there's anything such as absolute wrong. So step aside. I'm going to take your kid's life. No, you're not allowed to do that. Well, there are no absolutes. So we're working out of both sides of our mouth. We're claiming there are no absolutes, and then we're requiring people to function with respect to us as though there are. But when you stay with the Genesis worldview, you have a transcendent God who establishes right and establishes wrong, and it's absolute not because society constructed it that way, but because God put it that way in place. And so this is added as conscience, to conscience as a ruling factor. By the way, there's Romans 13. I forgot I'd put it in the PowerPoint, but it talks about the minister of God bearing the sword. And he doesn't bear it for nothing. It's a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. Today, when we drive on our highways, we have ways of dealing with the wrath part and avoiding the ticket. So we call those radar detectors. But what about the conscience sake part here? It's an interesting thing to think about. And believe me, I am guilty as charged of myself sometimes wanting to skirt the law. But God reminds me here that I have a minister for the good of our society, and I ought to be in subjection for two reasons. One, because I do fear the consequence of the speeding ticket, but I also have a thing called a conscience. And I haven't trashed it, smashed it, flushed it, suppressed it. I'm actually listening to it. And that's a challenge. It is a challenge. But you see, I just mentioned that because this whole concept of human government is added to conscience as a new ruling element. We already talked about this yesterday, that when they ate the fruit, their eyes were open, and now they have a thing called a conscience, a new ruling element within their lives. God is going to call for their obedience through the voice of their conscience. Now God adds another ruling element. This whole concept of, let's just call it social justice. And it's calling for our obedience as well. Human government, social justice, calling for God is administering his rule through these things. You know, with all of the aberrations notwithstanding, with all of the faults of our society notwithstanding. And by the way, there is such a thing as illegitimate human government. And it's pretty easy to define. And when human government goes beyond the bounds of Scripture, and guys like Hitler start taking the lives of thousands of Jews, and they say we have the right to do it because I'm in charge of this country, he is well outside the scope of his God-ordained role because he is taking life that the Bible does not allow him to take. So this is a big topic, and I've digressed already too much. But once again, it's fascinating how so many things find their start point in the book of Genesis. Well, 8 through 17, I won't read, at least not most of it, but you have God making this promise. We call it the Noahic covenant. And God promises never another world-destroying global flood. Never again. Never another world-destroying global flood. And he makes it very clear. He says here in verse 11, I establish my covenant with you, and watch this now, with you, but also with all flesh. Well, he's talking to Noah, presumably his family as well, but he also says all flesh. If you back up into verse 9, it says, I'm establishing my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and verse 10, and with every living creature that is with you, birds and cattle and every beast of the earth. My point being that God is in a covenant relationship right now, or arrangement is probably a better word, not only with all of humanity, but with the entire animal kingdom. He has a promise out for all of that group. And it is never another world-destroying global flood. And he gives a sign for the covenant. In our third hour this morning, I hope to get to the issue of biblical covenants, and they usually had a sign. And the sign of it was the rainbow. And God says, every time you see that in the clouds, it's a sign of my covenant. Isn't it interesting how Satan has totally trashed the rainbow today to now associate it with an effacing of one of the most beautiful aspects of the image of God in mankind, gender, right? And Satan is laughing all the way to the bank because he's hijacked God's beautiful, physically beautiful, sign of a beautiful promise that he will never again destroy the earth. And so you can see the spiritual dynamics here going on behind the scenes, this age-long struggle between Satan and God that is still playing out today in our society. And this covenant was made with mankind as well as with the animal kingdom. Now, the fact that rainbows occurred only then, and we can't prove this, but if that's the case, It would indicate either direct sunlight or rain or both were absent before the flood. Now, I want to repeat that. I probably should have phrased that sentence slightly differently because it's not a fact that rainbows didn't occur before. We just can't establish it as a fact. It does seem, though, however, likely that rainbows didn't occur before. It seems to be something new. But it is possible, have to allow for it, it is totally possible that God took something that Noah already had seen and said, I'm going to turn it into a symbol. But if rainbows had not occurred prior to the flood, it would argue for one or the other of two ingredients missing. Either direct sunlight didn't occur before the flood, or rain didn't happen in sufficient quantities, or perhaps both of them were absent. Well, then we come to the later part of chapter 9, and I have just enough time to introduce it here. We have a really strange account. Noah gets drunk inside his tent. And it's kind of like, I don't know about you, but it's like, what? What's this doing in the story? Like when you consider the grand scope of what's going on and all of what's being taught to us here, why would the text stop to relay this kind of odd event? Clearly it has strategic importance. Kind of like the first 4 chapters of Genesis 6 with those weird, sons of God, daughters of men and stuff. And, forget the theories for the moment. The fact that it's there must have had a strategic connection with the flood. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that what happens here does have a strategic connection with what will happen in chapters 10 and 11. And so we have a situation where Noah is going to pronounce some blessings and some cursings on his 3 sons and their descendants. And those blessings and those cursings are going to have long-term consequences for the nations and civilizations that will arise out of his 3 sons. So these verses open by telling us that all modern civilizations derive from Noah and his 3 sons. Verse 18, now the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem and Ham and Japheth, and Ham was the father of Canaan, and these 3 were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated. So friends, all of us sitting here today are either a descendant of Shem or a descendant of Ham or a descendant of Japheth, somewhere in the mix. Because the Bible is teaching here that all of the nations of the world, the whole earth rather, was populated from the sons of Noah. And you come to verse 20, and this is where this strange story starts. Let me just briefly intro it. Noah begins farming, he plants a vineyard, he drinks of the wine, becomes drunk, uncovers himself inside of his tent. And his 3 sons react to this in different ways. And the ways in which they react to his nakedness and his drunkenness inside of his tent is going to have huge, long-lasting implications. It's in this section that we're going to find the only recorded words of Noah in all of the Bible. They're not very long, but we have him blessing, we have him cursing. It's the only words that we have recorded about Noah. But what he will say here will set the stage for the destiny of future civilizations in many respects. And I hope to be able to demonstrate why as we move into chapters 10 and 11 for our final hour.